I'm Emily Weidenhoff.
And I'm Diniece Mendes.
On today's episode, we talk to Donald Shoup, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA and the author of The High Cost of Free Parking.
His research is focused on land economics, public finance, transportation, and parking. Donald holds degrees from Yale, both a Bachelor of Engineering in Electrical Engineering and a PhD in Economics.
We're very excited to welcome Donald Shoup to the conversation today. Professor Shoup, have to ask you, have you ever parked for free?
Well, thanks for inviting me. And for the question, I think when I'm a driver, I almost never pay for parking, just like everybody else in the United States. When you go to the grocery store, there's free parking at the grocery store, even at Trader Joe's. But in all my other roles in life, as a taxpayer and a shopper and a resident, I paid a lot for parking because the cost of parking doesn't go away just because the driver doesn't pay for it. Somebody has to pay for it, and that somebody is everybody. Even people who cannot afford a car have to pay for parking. Say when you go to a grocery store, people who can't afford a car have to pay higher prices for food so richer people can park free at the grocery store. This is really required by the government because most governments outside of New York require ample off-street parking for everything. You can't build a grocery store. You can't open a grocery store unless it has usually 5 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is more land for parking than for the grocery store. And I think the minimum parking requirements increase the class divide between people who can afford a car and people who can't. And the people who can't afford a car subsidize people who can afford a car. So yes, I don't pay for parking when I'm a driver, but I'm paying for it in every other role I have in life and every role you have in life.
So parking policies vary greatly across the world. We're curious to hear from someone with a global perspective such as yours. What country or international city does parking best, in your opinion?
I think Amsterdam is usually the first answer anybody would give, that they have had a policy for several years, and every year they reduce the number of parking spaces in the city by about 3%. They have permit parking districts, and when people leave or die, they don't renew the permits. So they gradually reduce the number of parking spaces in the city. And I know what a difference it made because the first time I went to Amsterdam was in 1962, and there were cars everywhere. It looked like Los Angeles. But they realized that in an older city like Manhattan, they just can't keep on going with everybody wanting to have a car. Copenhagen does the same thing. They've been reducing the parking supply by about 3% a year. And again, I saw that when I was an intern at the Copenhagen Telephone Company in 1964, that I drove into work every day and parked free in one of the wonderful squares that they have. A lot of, plazas had been turned into parking. And I went to Copenhagen a couple of years ago, and all of those cars were gone. So we can have changes, and I think we have to have changes.
So, Professor Shoup, you're a bit of a legend in the urban planning field. Some know you as Shoup Dogg. Could you, for a minute, take us back and share a bit about what led you to urban planning?
Well, it started in New York, in Manhattan. I was a PhD student in economics, and I was writing my dissertation on the land market, and I worked at the Institute of Public Administration on West 44th Street. And I've been working on land economics. I did notice that almost all cars park free on some of the most valuable land on Earth. And I thought, well, how would a land economist explain this? It is very puzzling. And I have been sort of following with that insight since about 60 years.
So cities are very aware of the struggle of balancing limited resources with demand for services. You've thought a lot about how to bring in revenue to support urban resources. Could you tell us more about parking benefits districts?
Well, yes, that's my favorite topic, but I will give a bit of a preface, is that I have three major reforms. One is to remove minimum parking requirements, which you're not talking about today because New York has done most of that and is about to remove all parking requirements, I hope. The second is to charge the right prices for curb parking. Now, who could object to the right prices? Except that they're not zero. That the right price for curb parking, I think most people who have studied it agree, is the lowest price the city could charge and still have one or two open spaces on every block. So that wherever you drive, you'll see one or two open spaces. And this policy was recommended by Columbia economics professor back in 1954. He said that the price should be adjusted so that people can always find an open space if they're willing to pay for it. So the proposal that I made, that is now spreading around the world, and I hope it will spread to New York, is called parking benefit districts. And that is that if the city charges market prices for curb parking, and spends all or most of the revenue to pay for added public services on the metered block. That if money goes into a parking meter, it comes out the other side, it cleans the sidewalk or plants street trees or removes graffiti every night. Cities have used the money for a number of things like that. And when people can see the benefits of charging for parking, they're more eager to have parking meters. London surveyed residents to say, what are your highest priorities for the curb lane? Parking was number 5. They wanted recreation in it. They wanted trees in it. They wanted outdoor eating in it. So when you ask everybody what they want, not just the drivers at a public meeting, the drivers can take over at a community meeting about curb parking, and it will make a politician think that it's a quick way to commit political suicide is to recommend prices for curb parking. But if you say that the money will stay in the neighborhood, then people look at it differently.
You certainly raised some really interesting points around framing and really what's important for gaining buy-in from communities. I'm curious, though, many cities have experimented with reducing parking minimums. You spoke about that a little bit previously, and particularly in new developments. What have been some of the most surprising or impactful outcomes from these experiments based on your research?
Well, it happened very early that Pasadena, California, was the first city that had a parking benefit district. The city had no parking meters at all, and there was an older part of town, which was once one of the most upscale shopping districts in the country, that people from the Midwest would come to California to spend the winter. If you had enough money, you would come to California in the winter, and they congregated in Pasadena. So it was that after World War II, most people had cars, and this older neighborhood, with more like the Upper West Side, it didn't have any off-street parking because they didn't have that in the 1920s. So it had decayed. They were wonderful buildings in terrible condition. People thought it would never recover. But the city wanted to put in parking meters to solve the curb parking problem. And the merchants said, that's a terrible idea that'll chase away the few customers we have, although they knew that the business people and their employees parked on the street and moved their cars every 2 hours, and then complained that the city hadn't provided enough parking. So the mayor said, well, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the revenue to pay for rebuilding all of your sidewalks, putting in historic streetlights, cleaning up all the alleys, and providing many more public services. And the merchants immediately said, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's put the meter in now. Why was it taking you so long? Let's run them on till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Only because they got the revenue. And even though they had previously said it will damage businesses, the sales tax revenue tripled in the next 5 years. And that's a measure of business activity. Once the city had done what only the city can do, which is to improve the public sphere, then the private property owners came through with historic preservation, and they spent a lot of money on their own properties because previously it didn't make sense to pay for a high price for historic preservation if nobody was coming there. So, and this has happened in many other neighborhoods. The thing that surprised me is how quickly the sales tax revenue increased.
So, what lessons can other cities learn from these other experiments that other cities can take into account?
Oh, they are learning. The parking benefit districts and market prices for curb parking are spreading around. Mexico City, some of my students work in Mexico City, and they had picked up on what they call the Shoup Dogma, that Snoop Dogg and I were both born in Long Beach, so that's some connection. And so the students call me Shoup Dogg, and they call what I teach the Shoup Dogma. So some of them had taken the Shoup Dogma to Mexico City, and they measured all new property development I think from 2010 to 2015, and 40% of all the built space was for parking. And so they realized that's and all the curb parking was free. So they began charging prices for curb parking, and they converted all the minimum parking requirements into maximum parking limits. Just made a complete U-turn, and in addition, that anything more than half of the maximum allowed, you have to pay a tax on. So they really began discouraging building off-street parking. At least they stopped requiring it. And then yes, a number of other cities have done it. Say, Houston is another big city. They've picked up on them. I think the bigger the city, the more important it is to have parking benefit districts.
So let's talk about another kind of incentive. You've researched employer-paid parking, which essentially incentivizes employees to drive to work because their job compensates them for parking costs. Can you talk about the benefits and challenges of cash-out employer-paid parking?
Well, that was one of the first successes I had in convincing anybody to do anything, because I saw a study of downtown LA that compared the commuting behavior of two sets of government employees. Well, the federal employees who had to pay for parking, and the other one was the county employees who all got free parking. And among the county employees, I think something like 73% drove to work alone. And among the federal employees, 42% drove to work alone. And this was at the time we were trying to, during the gas crisis of the 70s, and we were trying to do everything we could to reduce traffic and vehicle miles traveled. And here I then understood that almost all employers gave free parking. And I said, that's a bad idea, but that didn't get anywhere. You're not going to convince anybody that they ought to pay for parking at work. So again, you need a political fix. What is the key to that? And so the solution I recommended was that if an employer offers free parking at work, it has to offer the commuter the option to take the cash value of the parking subsidy. So if the parking at that time is about $150 a month, so instead of taking $150 a month as a free parking spaces, you could have $150 a month. So that's not taking anything away from anybody. It's giving to people who previously had been disenfranchised. That if they were biking to work or walking to work or riding the bus to work, they got nothing. That's not fair. And that's how I approach the idea. Employer-paid parking is, without parking cash out, is unfair, especially because higher income employees are the ones who have cars and are more likely to drive. So that became a law in California.
We're going to switch gears to talk about sort of New York City's most contested real estate, the curb. Many cities and urban areas struggle with managing sort of this limited curb space and certainly a lot more competing needs and growing demands with the rise of e-commerce, deliveries, etc. How do you think cities can better manage curb space to balance the needs of goods movement, passenger vehicles, and other uses? And what role do you see parking policy playing in this context?
Well, I think the short answer is charge the right prices for curb parking. That you want to raise the price or lower the price until there are one or two open spaces on every block. And San Francisco has done this since I think 2011. They started a very elaborate pilot program that they had, I think, 7,000 metered spaces they put on pricing system, and they adjusted prices up or down every 3 months. That if in the previous 3 months the spaces were overcrowded, they raised the price by 25 cents. And if they were under occupied, they would lower the price by 50 cents, because it turned up. People thought that the prices would skyrocket. But after 2 years of slowly getting towards the right price, 25 cents an hour increasing every 3 months, that the total meter revenue declined by 4%. And that's because so many of the spaces were underoccupied in the morning. You see whole blocks that were charging $1.50 an hour, and there's not a single car parked there. So they began reducing the price of parking where the price had been too high, and increasing it on spaces that had been priced too low, with a maximum of $6 at the peak. And after they had done all that, the total revenue was about the same.
We're entering into a new era of urban parking with increasing popularity of micromobility options and ride-sharing services. How do you see the future of urban parking evolving?
Well, I think the proper management of curb parking will benefit certainly bike sharing, and certainly car sharing. It'll definitely benefit car sharing. I think charging the right prices for curb parking is like urban acupuncture. A small touch in a small part can benefit the whole body. Um, and in another medical analogy, that these crowded curb spaces with cars cruising for parking, we haven't talked about that yet, but when all the curb spaces are filled, a lot of cars are driving around hunting for parking. There was a study down at the Upper West Side found that it caused something like 300,000 additional vehicle miles traveled in a 16-block area of cars. They were just hunting for parking. That would disappear. In another medical analogy, streets in a city are like blood vessels in a human body. And crowded curb parking is like plaque on the insides of these blood vessels that accumulate and slow the blood flow and lead to strokes. So I think that charging for the right price for curb parking will clean out all the plaque in the arteries of the city. That it'll make the city much. There are two ways to make the city healthy. I think one is through urban acupuncture, and the other one is cleaning out the excess plaque in all the streets.
Well, let's stick with that analogy around sort of healthier cities and sort of arteries. So to make meaningful changes in parking policy, we often need to shift cultural perceptions and habits. What do you think are some of the biggest cultural shifts needed to move the needle on parking policy?
Well, I think that the parking benefit districts are the key to everything. That you don't have to convince anybody that they should charge market prices for curb parking. They'll decide for themselves. That if you give people the right incentives, they will make the right decisions. With free curb parking is the worst incentive you can give. And the bigger the city, the denser the city, the worse free curb parking is. So I think a pilot program, carefully put together and carefully evaluated, would show how to make it work. Can we charge by the minute very easily? And now the technology of parking is so much better, especially with license plate recognition. And new cars in Europe now have the method of payment for parking in the dashboard of the car. The car is just as connected as your telephone is. It knows where it is, and it knows what the prices are for everything, for parking prices. And that when you arrive at your destination, you just touch on the screen saying, I'm starting paying for parking. And when you move out, you stop paying for parking. So it would be almost effortless, not confusing to the drivers. It'll be a while before all cars have this, but all cell phones have it. And I think that it'll become more like something that people won't even notice. That when a new technology for cars comes along, like automatic transmissions or power steering or power brakes, they seemed miraculous. And everybody thought they were just optional add-ons for expensive cars. But now you take it for granted. You don't even think of it. You don't even think you're using power steering. And I think when parking fades into the background in terms of pricing, the people, well, of course you pay for parking, and I don't have to do anything. Then I think that New York will be infinitely better than it is now.
Well, Donald, we really appreciate your time with us today and sharing the Shoup Dogma with our listeners. Before we sign off, we just wanted to ask you, what is something about the future of transportation that you are most enthusiastic about?
Parking. Well, I think one reason that parking has been neglected, certainly by planners, is that the transportation planners don't think about parking, curb parking, because nothing is moving. And urban planners don't think about curb parking because it's in the roadway. That nobody seemed to be responsible for thinking about parking. But I've been thinking about parking for 50 years, and I was successful because it's such a low status thing to study. That in universities, there's national affairs and international affairs seem important, and state affairs are a big step down. Local affairs seem like they're parochial. And what's the least prestigious thing to study at the local government? It would be sewage and parking. So I was a bottom feeder for about 50 years. I didn't have any competition. That's why there aren't that many people you can interview. But now there's a feeding frenzy down there. Everybody's interested in it. That's why I'm on your podcast. People are realizing there's a lot of food down there. And cities would be much more livable if we don't always want to park free.
We agree.
Well, Donald, we really appreciate your time and talking about your perspectives around parking policy and your enthusiasm. So thank you.
Yeah, and there's thank you for helping us see all the value we should be getting from our streets to make them more livable for all New Yorkers.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And I hope my perspective will become your perspective. And I hope these ideas get turned into practice in New York.